It wasn't enough that he left me for a woman half my age, a girl who was barely out of her teens. He didn't just have to break my heart, he had to shatter my life, drain our shared history down to the last cent, and leave me standing in the rubble of what I thought was our forever. Now, years later, he's standing on the polished marble steps of my house, a magnificent home bought with every single penny he tried to hide from me, and he's begging for a piece of bread. My life with him had been a quiet symphony of support and sacrifice. For 25 years, I was the silent partner in his grand ascent. People think support means nodding along while someone else talks. For me, it meant being the person who read the contracts at 2 a.m. while he was asleep. It meant knowing the names of the wives and children of every potential investor. It meant remembering that Mr. Arasaka preferred green tea over black, and that the CEO of global tech had a daughter with a peanut allergy. I was the one who curated the environment in which his ambition could breathe. In the early days, back in that drafty apartment with the mismatched chairs, I was the one who did the payroll. I remember the smell of the old checkbook, the sound of the calculator's keys, a rhythmic clacking that felt like the heartbeat of our future. We were a team, or so I thought. Mark had the vision, the charisma, the ability to sell ice to an Inuit. But I had the structure. I had the discipline. I was the one who made sure the ice was actually delivered on time and within budget. I remember one specific night, David was just a toddler. Emily wasn't even a thought yet. We had a crisis. A major client was threatening to pull out because of a shipping delay. Mark was pacing the floor, his face red, his tie undone. He was ready to give up, to take the loss and move on. "Sit down, Mark," I'd said, my voice calm as a still lake. "I've already called the logistics manager in Singapore. I've arranged for a bypass through the Tokyo hub. The shipment will arrive 6 hours early. Now, go put David back to bed and have some tea." He'd looked at me with such wonder then. "What would I do without you, Clara?" he'd asked. That was the man I loved, the man who recognized that his empire was built on my labor. But as the zeros in our bank account grew, his memory for those moments began to fade. Recognition turned into tolerance, and tolerance turned into the cold indifference that eventually led to Amber. I managed the home, raised our children, David and Emily, who were the center of my universe and eventually the collateral damage of his ego, hosted the endless dinners for his clients, and smoothed over his rough edges with a gentle smile and a perfectly mixed drink. I remember those dinners vividly, the smell of slow-roasted lamb and rosemary filling our high-ceilinged dining room, the crystal glasses catching the light of the chandelier, the sound of expensive shoes on hardwood. I was the ghost in the machine, ensuring every guest felt important while my own needs were quietly tucked away like old linens. David was 10 when he first asked why Daddy was always on the phone at the table. Emily was 7 when she started mimicking my habit of holding her breath whenever the front door opened, gauging the temperature of her father's mood before deciding whether to run to him or stay in her room. The children were my anchors. David, with his father's analytical mind but my sensitive heart, and Emily, a firecracker of a girl who could see through a lie before it was even spoken. They were the ones I was building for, the ones I thought were safe in the fortress of our marriage. How wrong I was. When the fortress fell, they were the ones buried in the rubble, and their father didn't even look back to see if they were breathing. The first crack in that foundation was almost imperceptible. It started about 2 years before the end. A subtle shift in his demeanor, a new cologne I didn't recognize, something musky and aggressive, not the clean woodsy scent he'd worn for decades. Then came the password on his phone, where there had never been one before. "Security for the firm," he'd said, not even looking up from his tablet. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He started talking about feeling stagnant, about needing a change. I suggested we take a trip, maybe renew our vows in Italy, where we'd spent our honeymoon. I remember sitting on our porch that evening, the air smelling of jasmine and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. I was wearing the blue dress he used to love. He just stared at me with a hollow look in his eyes, a look I would later understand was a mixture of pity and contempt. "I don't think a vacation is going to fix this, Clara," he'd said, his voice flat and distant, like he was reading a balance sheet for a bankrupt company. This was our marriage, our life, me. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing. He slept like a man with a clear conscience, while I felt like I was drowning in a sea of unspoken questions. I thought about the early years, the tiny apartment in the city, the shared pizzas on the floor because we couldn't afford a table, the way he used to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear and tell me we were going to conquer the world together. We did conquer it, but somewhere along the way, he decided the world was too small for both of us. The day it all came crashing down was a Tuesday. I remember the weather was offensively beautiful, the sun streaming through the windows of the home I had so lovingly decorated, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a cruel reminder that even in my perfect home, there was unseen dirt. He came home early, which was unusual. He didn't kiss me hello. He didn't even acknowledge the fresh flowers I'd just placed on the foyer table. He just stood there, his expensive briefcase in one hand, looking at me as if I were a stranger he'd accidentally bumped into on the street. Then he dropped the bomb with the casual air of someone announcing they were out of milk. "I'm leaving you, Clara," he said. There was no emotion, no regret, just a statement of fact. He told me he'd met someone. The other woman, as I would come to call her in my mind, was revealed to be a 22-year-old intern at his firm. Her name was Amber, a name that sounded like a cheap candle, but a presence that had set my world on fire. He said she was young, vibrant, and made him feel seen. Every word was a carefully chosen dagger, designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain. He wanted me to know I was being replaced, not just left. I was being upgraded from, like an old piece of software that had become too slow, too familiar, too boring. "She doesn't ask me about the budget," he sneered, his face contorted with a cruelty I'd never seen. "She doesn't remind me of my age. She doesn't talk about our children's college funds. She just enjoys me." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, creeping shame that burned my cheeks and choked the air from my lungs. He wasn't just ending our marriage, he was erasing me. He was telling me that 25 years of shared history, of raising children, of building a life, was worth less than the vibrancy of a girl who hadn't even been born when we bought our first car. He packed a single bag, filled with his most expensive suits and watches, all bought with money I had helped him earn, money I had meticulously managed while he played the visionary. He didn't look back. As the tires of his car crunched on the gravel driveway, I realized that I didn't even know who the man in my house had been for the last few years. That night, I didn't cry. I sat in the silent, cavernous house and felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. It wasn't grief, it was rage. A quiet, patient rage that I knew, even then, would become my closest companion. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, looking at the photos, and realized that everything I thought was ours was actually mine. He had just been a temporary tenant in my devotion. This was just the beginning of his cruelty, the first act in a play of utter devastation. He started moving money that same week. David called me from college, his voice trembling, telling me his tuition check had bounced. Emily's credit card was declined at the grocery store. He wasn't just leaving me, he was trying to starve us out. He was trying to show me that without him, I was nothing. But he forgot one very important thing. I was the one who had handled the books for the first decade. I was the one who knew the names of every shell company, every offshore account, every secret handshake he'd made on his way to the top. He thought he was a genius who had outgrown his simple wife. He didn't realize he'd just handed a loaded gun to the one person who knew exactly where his armor was thin. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled his new life and built my own glorious one from its ruins, make sure you subscribe to Silent Wife's Vengeance. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single detail of how justice was served, cold and satisfying. I called my mother. Her voice was like steel over the phone, a voice that had survived the loss of her own husband and the rebuilding of her life from scratch. My mother, Martha, was a woman who'd lived through the Great Depression and the transition of our city from a manufacturing hub to a tech oasis. She'd seen empires rise and fall, and she'd always told me that the only thing a woman truly owns is her integrity and her bank account. When I married Mark, she'd been skeptical. "He has a hunger in his eyes that isn't for you, Clara," she'd warned. "It's for the world. Just make sure you're not the one he eats along the way." I hadn't listened. I was in love, but now, 25 years later, her words were the only thing keeping me upright. I drove to her small, perfectly kept house that evening. The smell of lavender and old books greeted me, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive scent of the mansion I'd just left. We sat in her kitchen, and she made me a cup of tea, not the herbal infusions Mark liked, but strong, black tea with a spoonful of sugar. "Don't you dare shed another tear for that man, Clara," she said, her voice sharp and clear as a winter morning. "Tears won't pay David's tuition or Emily's rent. He thinks you're a fool. He thinks you're a decorative object that's lost its shine. Your job now is to prove him wrong. Don't get sad, get smart. And then, get even. Remember what I told you when you were a little girl. A woman without her own money is a woman without a voice. It's time to start shouting." Her words were the splash of cold water I needed. The fog of shock and hurt began to dissipate, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She was right. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a war, and I had no intention of losing. I spent that first night sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned our first home, with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I started making a list, not of things I'd lost, but of things I knew. My first move was to hire the best forensic accountant I could find. I didn't want a big firm that he could buy off. I wanted a hunter. I found Arthur Miller, a quiet, unassuming man who lived in a basement apartment and smelled faintly of old paper and mint tea. He had eyes like a hawk and a mind like a steel trap. Our first meeting lasted 7 hours. Arthur had piles of digital records and printed spreadsheets that looked like a foreign language to me. But as he talked, the patterns began to emerge. "You see this, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, pointing to a series of recurring wire transfers to a shell company in Panama. "They're disguised as consulting fees for a firm that doesn't exist. He's been moving $50,000 a month for 3 years. That's $1.8 million right there, hidden in plain sight." We spent weeks in that basement. I became an expert in layering, the process of making illicit funds look legitimate by moving them through a complex series of transactions. Mark was using a double Irish structure, a tax avoidance technique that I eventually used to corner him. Every night, I would go home to our silent mansion and play the part of the grieving wife, while my brain was buzzing with account numbers and swift codes. One night, Arthur found the mother lode. It was a digital trail leading to a private vault in Switzerland. Mark hadn't just been hiding cash. He'd been buying physical gold and rare art. He'd even bought a small island in the Caribbean through a trust he'd set up for Amber's future. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to disappear into a life of luxury that he had built with my life's work. "He's using the company's R&D budget to fund his personal escape pod," Arthur whispered, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration for the complexity of the fraud. "It's beautiful, in a perverse way. But he made one mistake. He used his personal email to authorize the first transfer 3 years ago. He thought he deleted it, but the server at the firm keeps a backup for 7 years. I found it, Mrs. Hayes. I found the smoking gun." That smoking gun was what eventually broke his spirit in the courtroom. It was a single email to his offshore banker that said, "Transfer the $5 million from the primary account to the Project Freedom Fund. Ensure the wife has no visibility." Project Freedom. That was his name for his betrayal. I remember the afternoon Arthur Miller showed me that email. We were in his basement, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the hum of 3 different computer towers. The light was dim, only the blue glow of the monitors illuminating Arthur's face. He looked like a priest performing an exorcism. "Clara," he said, his voice unusually soft. "You need to see this. I've been tracking the movement of the Project Freedom funds. It wasn't just a getaway fund. He was using it to short the company's own stock through a series of proxy accounts in the Bahamas." I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring. He was betting against his own life's work. "No," Arthur corrected. "He was betting against your share of it. By driving the stock price down temporarily, he could buy back the shares at a fraction of the cost once the divorce was finalized, and he'd emerge as the savior of the company. It's a classic pump and dump, but he was using the divorce as the catalyst." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement air. Mark hadn't just found a new lover. He'd planned a surgical strike against my future. He wanted me to have the house because he knew the market was about to crash and the mortgage would bury me. He wanted the alimony to be small because he'd already moved the liquidity offshore. "Can you prove it?" I asked. Arthur smiled, a rare, jagged expression. "In my world, Clara, numbers never lie. People do, but the ledger is always honest. I have the SWIFT confirmations. I have the IP addresses of the logins to the Bahamian accounts. They all trace back to the VPN he used from your guest house." The guest house. The place where he said he was working late to avoid disturbing me. He was dismantling our children's inheritance while I was bringing him coffee and telling him to get some rest. I walked out of the basement and into the cool evening air. I didn't go home. I drove to the park where we used to take David and Emily when they were small. I sat on a bench and watched a young couple laughing, their baby asleep in a stroller. I felt a profound sense of mourning, not for the man I'd lost, but for the woman I'd been. The woman who had believed that love was a shield against this kind of calculated cruelty. But as the sun set, the morning turned into a hard, diamond-like resolve. I called Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah," I said, "we have Project Freedom. I want everything. I want the Bahamian accounts. I want the Bahamas company. I want the guest house. I want his reputation. I want him to understand that the silent partner has decided to speak." Sarah didn't even hesitate. "Consider it done, Clara. We file the criminal referral on Monday. Fraud, tax evasion, and securities manipulation. He's not just losing a wife. He's losing his liberty." The weekend before we filed was the hardest. I had to look him in the eye when he came to pick up his remaining things. He was whistling, Amber waiting in the car at the end of the driveway, the engine of her new Rover idling like a predator. "You okay, Clara?" he asked, his voice dripping with that fake practiced concern. "You look a bit pale. You really should see a doctor." "I'm fine, Mark," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "I'm just finishing a project I've been working on." "That's good," he said, not even bothering to ask what it was. "Keep yourself busy. It helps with the transition." Transition? He had no idea what kind of transition was coming. When the FBI showed up at his firm on Tuesday morning, I was sitting in my mother's kitchen, drinking that strong black tea. I watched the news on her old television, seeing the grainy footage of agents carrying boxes of documents out of the Hayes & Associates building. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, like the last piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle finally clicking into place. The silence of the house wasn't a void anymore. It was a canvas. The trial of Mark Hayes, a clinical dismantling. The criminal trial began 6 months after the FBI raid. It was a cold, rainy Monday in November, the kind of day where the air feels heavy with the weight of unsaid things. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by my children. Mark sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his once expensive suit hanging off his frame like a shroud. He looked like a man who had already been convicted by his own choices. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Arthur Miller took the stand for 3 days. He spoke in the dry, rhythmic tones of a man who lives in the world of ledgers, but his words were devastating. He walked the jury through every shell company, every double Irish structure, and every cent of the Project Freedom Fund. He showed them how Mark had systematically looted our children's future to fund a life that was nothing more than a neon sign for his own ego. But the most dramatic moment was when Amber was called to testify. She entered the courtroom looking like a ghost. The vibrancy that Mark had traded his life for was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed terror. She had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. "Did Mr. Hayes tell you where the money for the Costa Rica estate came from?" the prosecutor asked. Amber looked at Mark, then at me. Her voice was a thin, trembling wire. "He said it was his exit fee. He said Clara was too stupid to ever find it. He said he earned it by putting up with her for 25 years. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Mark didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at the wooden table as if he could disappear into the grain of the oak. My lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, sat next to me and squeezed my hand. "It's over, Clara," she whispered. "He's not fighting you anymore. He's just waiting for the dark." The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. 24 counts of fraud, 3 counts of securities manipulation, and 5 counts of tax evasion. Mark was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. As he was led away in handcuffs, he stopped for a split second in front of me. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated recognition. He finally saw the woman he had tried to erase, and he saw that she was the one who had written the ending to his story. I took that table. I took the company. And I took the future he thought he'd bought with our past. The day of the deposition was a masterpiece of theatre, a performance I'd been rehearsing in the mirror for months. I wore a drab grey dress that was 2 sizes too big, and I'd skipped my morning coffee to ensure I looked slightly shaky, slightly unravelled. No makeup, my hair pulled back into a messy, pathetic bun. I looked every bit the part of the discarded, helpless wife, the woman who'd lost her husband, her home, and her mind. Mark swaggered in, looking like a king. He was tanned, likely from a weekend in Miami with Amber, and wearing a $3,000 suit I'd once helped him pick out. He gave me a look of pity, a condescending little smirk that said, "Poor Clara, she can't even dress herself anymore." He sat across from me, radiating a level of arrogance that was almost suffocating. His high-powered lawyer, a man who charged $800 an hour to tell lies, started by questioning my mental stability. They wanted to prove I was incompetent, that I shouldn't have any control over our assets because I was unstable. Mark lied under oath for 3 straight hours. He painted a picture of a failing business, of how he'd been forced to move money to save the firm from my extravagant spending. He said he'd been miserable for years, that I was a cold, distant wife who only cared about the house and the kids. I sat there, looking down at my trembling hands, and I didn't say a word. I let him talk. I let him dig a hole so deep he'd never see the sky again. Then, it was our turn. Sarah Jenkins stood up. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like an assassin in a blazer. With a calm, deliberate voice, she began to dismantle his world piece by piece. She didn't start with the affair. She started with the numbers. "Mr. Hayes," she said, sliding a document across the table. "Could you explain why the company paid $200,000 to Amber Skies on the same day you claimed you were in Chicago for a conference?" Mark's smirk faltered. "It was a marketing consultant." "I see," Sarah said, sliding another paper. "And is this marketing consultant also the owner of the apartment in Soho that the company has been paying the rent for? The same Amber who happens to be 22 years old and, let's see here, currently on your insurance policy as a dependent." The colour drained from Mark's face. He looked at his lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in his own pen. Sarah didn't stop. She presented the evidence of the offshore accounts, the deeds to the properties in Cabo, the photos of him and Amber buying jewellery at Cartier with the company credit card. With each piece of evidence, the air in the room became harder to breathe. Mark's confident posture collapsed. He went from king of the world to a small, caught animal in the space of 20 minutes. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in months. And in my eyes, he didn't see a broken woman. He didn't see the wife he'd discarded. He saw the architect of his downfall. He saw the woman who had known everything and waited for the perfect moment to strike. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You did this." "No, Mark," I said, my voice as cold as the ice in a winter pond. "You did this. I just made sure someone was watching." He thought he was building a new, shiny life on the ashes of the one we had built together. He had no clue that I was meticulously building an unshakable empire from the very evidence he was so carelessly leaving behind. If you believe that a woman's silence is not weakness, that it is the quiet before the storm of justice, then hit that like button right now. Show the world that you stand with every woman who has ever been underestimated. The legal battle was brutal, but the outcome was never in doubt. The judge was appalled by his deceit. The court awarded me everything. Not 50%, not 70%, but 100% of the hidden assets, plus punitive damages for his fraud. I got the business, the properties, the entire fortune he had tried to steal. He was left with nothing but crippling debt and a court order to pay my legal fees, which were, to my immense satisfaction, astronomical. His empire was now my empire. His life imploded with spectacular speed, like a building being demolished from the inside out. The other woman, Amber, who had been so enamored with his wealth and the power he radiated, was not nearly as interested in a man drowning in debt and facing potential criminal charges for fraud. She left him within a month, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. The Range Rover was repossessed, the Soho apartment was cleared out, and she moved on to her next target, leaving Mark alone in a world that no longer recognized him. Without the money to fund their lavish lifestyle, their love was revealed for what it was: a transaction. He lost his friends, those fair-weather associates who only appeared when the champagne was flowing. He lost his business contacts, who saw him as a liability. He lost his place in the society he'd tried so hard to impress. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about at the country club he could no longer afford to enter. I, on the other hand, flourished. I took over the company he had founded. I didn't sell it. I rebuilt it. I fired the sycophants he'd hired and brought back the people who actually knew how to work. I used the money I'd recovered from the offshore accounts to stabilize the firm, and with a few smart decisions I'd been suggesting to him for years only to be ignored, I made it more profitable than ever. I was no longer the silent partner. I was the CEO. But the corporate victory was only half the battle. The real work was healing the damage Mark had done to our children. David had been so disillusioned by his father's betrayal that he'd nearly dropped out of law school. He'd seen the justice system through the lens of his father's fraud and wanted no part of it. Emily had become withdrawn, her vibrant spark dimmed by the constant humiliation of being the discarded daughter of a man who preferred a girl her own age over his own family. I spent those first months in the new house focusing on them. We had dinners every Sunday, real dinners, without the high society pretense. We talked about everything. I told them the truth about the finances, not to make them hate their father more, but to show them that truth has a weight that eventually anchors a life. I watched as David found his passion for public defense, realizing that he could be the advocate for people who, like his mother, were being erased by powerful men. I watched Emily turn her pain into art, her design firm focusing on creating safe havens for people who had lost everything. There was also the matter of Amber. A few months ago, I was at a charity function. Ironically, one I was now sponsoring. I saw her across the room. She wasn't an intern anymore. She was working the coat check. Her vibrancy had been replaced by a hard, brittle edge. She recognized me, and for a second, I saw the same fear in her eyes that I'd seen in Mark's at the deposition. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just handed her my coat, tipped her generously, and walked into the ballroom where I was the guest of honor. The best revenge isn't seeing someone suffer. It's being so successful that their suffering is just a footnote in your day. I sold the house we had shared, a place now tainted with the memories of his betrayal and the smell of that cheap cologne. I wanted a fresh start, something that reflected the woman I'd become. That's when I heard through the grapevine about a house he had been obsessed with. It was a modern architectural marvel, a concrete and glass mansion perched on the edge of the hills, with panoramic views of the entire city. He'd shown me pictures of it when we were still married, his eyes gleaming with greed. "This is the endgame, Clara," he'd said. "Once I buy this, everyone will know I've made it." He was planning to buy it with the money he'd stolen from me, a place he intended to share with Amber. He'd even had blueprints for a custom wine cellar and a theatre room, but the bankruptcy court had other ideas. The property went to auction. I attended the auction in person. I didn't wear a grey dress this time. I wore a tailored black suit and a pair of sunglasses that cost more than Mark's current monthly rent. The auction was held in a sterile conference room in a downtown hotel. There were 3 other serious bidders, real estate developers mostly, looking to flip the property for a quick profit. They looked at me as if I were a lost widow who'd accidentally stumbled into the wrong room. They didn't see the CEO of Hayes Global. They didn't see the woman who had already secured the financing through a private trust. The bidding started at $4 million. A man in a pinstripe suit, smelling of expensive cigars, raised the bid to 5. I waited. The price climbed to 7, then 8. One by one, the developers dropped out. The property was beautiful, but the market was cooling, and their profit margins were shrinking. At $9 million, only the pinstripe man and I were left. He looked at me, a cocky grin on his face. He thought he could intimidate me. He raised his paddle. 9.5, he barked. I didn't even look at him. I raised my finger. 10 million. He paused. 10 million was the ceiling for the property's current valuation. He whispered to his assistant, then raised his paddle again. 10.1. I didn't hesitate. 11 million. A gasp went through the room. 11 million was irrational. It was more than the house was worth by any financial metric. But they didn't understand the metric I was using. I wasn't buying a house. I was reclaiming a dream. I was buying the very thing Mark had tried to steal from me. The pinstripe man shook his head and walked out. I'd won. I'd paid in cash from the accounts he'd tried to hide. As I walked through the sun-drenched rooms of my new home for the first time, I felt a wicked, delicious sense of closure. Every floor-to-ceiling window, every marble countertop, every inch of this masterpiece was mine. It was a monument to his failure and my resilience. I decorated it with art that I liked, not things that looked expensive. I filled it with the laughter of David and Emily, who were finally thriving now that the shadow of their father's ego was gone. My new life was peaceful, powerful, and entirely my own. I traveled to Italy, not to renew vows, but to discover myself. I reconnected with friends I'd lost during the years I was too busy being Mrs. Hayes. I discovered a strength in myself I never knew I possessed, a quiet, immovable power that didn't need to shout to be heard. The silence in my life was no longer the silence of suppression. It was the silence of serenity. The Italian awakening, a symphony of the self. I remember my first morning in Positano. The air was a thick, sweet concoction of sea salt, lemon blossoms, and the smell of fresh espresso drifting from the cafe below my terrace. I was staying in a villa that Mark would have described as unnecessary. But to me, it was a sanctuary of necessary beauty. For the first time in 25 years, I woke up and didn't immediately check a schedule or gauge someone else's mood. I just watched the sun rise over the Tyrrhenian Sea, the water changing from a deep indigo to a shimmering, liquid gold. The sensory rebirth. I spent my afternoons in Ravello, a place that felt like it was suspended between the sky and the sea. The gardens of Villa Cimbron became my classroom. I learned the names of the roses. I felt the texture of the ancient marble statues. I listened to the wind whistling through the cypress trees, a sound that was a pure, clean contrast to the heavy, oppressive silence of the mansion I'd left. The food was a revelation. For decades, I had eaten for efficiency or to please Mark's guests. In Italy, I ate for joy. I remember a small trattoria where the owner, a woman in her 70s named Maria, served me a bowl of simple pasta with clams. The taste of the garlic, the fresh parsley, and the brine of the sea was so intense it made me cry. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder that the world was full of simple, honest textures that I had ignored for a girl who liked amber-scented candles. I spent my days walking the narrow, winding paths of the Amalfi Coast. I talked to local artisans who had been making the same leather sandals for generations. I ate meals that were simple and perfect: crusty bread, olive oil that tasted like liquid sunshine, and tomatoes that smelled like the earth itself. There was no one to impress, no one to correct my pronunciation, no one to remind me that I was getting older. In a small church in Ravello, I sat for 3 hours, listening to an elderly man play the organ. The music was heavy and complex, much like my life had been. But as the notes echoed off the ancient stone walls, I realized that the complexity wasn't a burden. It was a composition. My life with Mark, the betrayal, the investigation, the victory, they were all movements in a symphony that I was finally beginning to understand. I returned from Italy with a tan that Mark would have envied, and a peace that he would never understand. I was ready to build. My new home, the architectural masterpiece on the hill, became my living canvas. I worked with a lighting designer to ensure that every room captured the golden hour in a specific way. The living room, with its 40-foot glass walls, feels like a cathedral of light. The master bedroom, tucked away in the highest point of the structure, offers a view of the city that makes every problem look small. I filled the house with books I'd always wanted to read and art that made me feel alive, not things that were chosen because they matched a corporate aesthetic. I filled it with the laughter of David and Emily, who were finally thriving now that the shadow of their father's ego was gone. David spent a week here after his first big win in court. We sat on the terrace, drinking wine and talking about the future. He's dating a woman who is a brilliant civil rights lawyer. Emily is currently working on a project to design modular housing for disaster relief. They are building lives based on purpose, not just profit. They are the true return on my investment. Occasionally, I would hear whispers about him. He was working a menial job at a logistics firm, living in a tiny, run-down apartment near the industrial district, struggling to make ends meet. He'd been sued by some of his former business associates and was still paying off the legal fees from our divorce. It was a steep, brutal fall from the top of the world. I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, just a distant, detached sense of cosmic balance, like a history book being closed. Which brings me back to today, to this moment. He's standing on my doorstep, a ghost of the man he used to be. The sun is setting behind him, casting long, dramatic shadows across the driveway, but all I see is the darkness in his expression. His expensive suit is gone, replaced by worn-out jeans and a jacket that's seen better decades. His confident, chest-out posture is gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow slump. He's thinner, much thinner, his once sharp jawline now softened by age and stress. His hair, which he used to spend hundreds on to keep perfectly styled, is unkempt and grey. But it's his eyes that tell the real story. They hold a desperate, hunted look. The look of a man who has realized that the world doesn't care about his past glories. He doesn't even know this is my house. He's been walking the neighborhood, I suspect, looking for a handout in a place that used to welcome him. He holds out a hand, not in greeting, but in a plea. "Clara," he whispers, his voice raspy and thin, like dry leaves on pavement. He looks up at the towering glass and concrete structure, then back at me. Is this your place?" "It is," I say, my voice steady, sounding like the ticking of a very expensive clock. "Clara, please," he says, taking a step toward me. I don't move. I don't flinch. I just watch him with a detached interest, like a biologist observing a failing specimen. "You don't understand how bad it's been. The firm, they blackballed me. Amber, she took the last of the cash I'd kept in the safe. I'm living in a hostel, Clara. A hostel with 10 other men in a room that smells like wet dogs and failure. I breathe in the crisp evening air, which smells of jasmine and the expensive cedar mulch from my gardens. The smells of failure are often the ones we choose for ourselves, Mark. I just need a little help, he mumbles, looking down at his cracked shoes. I haven't had a real meal in 2 days, just enough for something to eat. For old time's sake, for the 25 years. I look at him, this stranger who wears my husband's face. I feel no anger, no hatred, not even a flicker of the old love. There is only a profound, unshakable calm. I think about the dinners I cooked. I think about the tuition checks he bounced. I think about Amber's Range Rover and David's tears. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, letting him stew in his own desperation on the steps of the life he threw away. The man I was married to, I say, and my words are like stones being dropped into a very deep well, would never have allowed himself to be in this position. He was a man of vision, a man of pride. He would have hated you, Mark. He would have looked at you with the same contempt you looked at me with that Tuesday morning. He flinches as if I'd struck him. And you, I continue, you are a stranger to me. The past isn't a debt you can collect on, especially not when you're the one who defaulted on it. You erased those 25 years when you packed that bag and didn't look back. You can't ask for old time's sake when you're the one who killed them. I don't raise my voice. I don't need to. The quiet finality of my words is more powerful than any shout could ever be. I see a flicker of understanding, of utter soul-crushing defeat in his eyes. He realizes that there is no mercy here, no soft landing. I'm hungry, he says, almost to himself. There's a shelter 3 miles from here, I say. They serve bread there. Perhaps you should start walking. Without another word, I slowly, deliberately close the heavy oak door. I watch through the narrow sidelight as the light fades from his face. I hear the click of the lock echoing in the grand foyer, a sound I've grown to love. It is the sound of a boundary being set. It is the sound of a full stop. The final punctuation on a chapter of my life I am glad to have finished. He closed a door on 25 years of marriage, on a life we built, on the woman who loved him. Today, I just closed a door on his last, desperate hope. The silence is finally, truly mine, and it is more golden than any fortune. But my story doesn't end there. Revenge is a dish best served cold, yes, but a life well lived is the greatest feast. David graduated law school last month, with honours. He's working in the public defender's office, helping people who actually need it. Emily is in New York, running her own design firm. They both spend their holidays here, in this house of glass and light, and we never mention the man who used to live in our shadow. We don't hate him. We just don't think about him. He is a ghost in a world that moved on without him. I've started a foundation, the Silent Partner Initiative. We provide legal and financial support for women who find themselves in the position I was in. We find the hidden accounts. We hire the forensic hunters. We make sure that the silent partners of the world are finally heard. As I sit on my terrace now, watching the city lights begin to twinkle like a billion diamonds, I realize that Mark was right about one thing. This was the end game. But it wasn't his, it was mine. If this story of justice brought you a measure of satisfaction, if you believe in the power of a woman to rise from the ashes and build a kingdom from the rubble, then share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is not loud and fiery, but a quiet, well-lived life, funded by a bank account that is entirely your own. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, silence is only a weakness if you let it be. If you use it to listen, to watch, and to plan, it becomes your greatest strength. Stay strong, stay silent, and never, ever be underestimated. The Golden Rule of Justice. Final reflection. As I stand here in the twilight of my revenge, I realize that the most powerful thing I own isn't the mansion or the company. It's the knowledge that I am the author of my own ending. Mark thought he could write me out of his story, but he forgot that I was the one holding the pen for 25 years. I want to speak to the Helenas and Claras out there. Those of you who have spent your lives building someone else's empire, who have sacrificed your dreams to fuel someone else's ambition. You are not invisible. Your silence is a reservoir of power. When the world tries to replace you with something younger, something shinier, something more convenient, don't scream, don't beg. Just watch. Watch for the cracks. Watch for the arrogance. And when the time is right, step into your own light. The bread Mark begged for today was a symbol. It was a reminder that the basic elements of a life, integrity, loyalty, truth, are things he can no longer afford. He is starving for the very thing he threw away. My foundation, the Silent Partner Initiative, is growing every day. We've helped 300 women this year alone. We've recovered over $50 million in stolen assets. We're changing the law so that Project Freedom funds can no longer be used as a weapon against the innocent. We have a network of forensic accountants, sharp-eyed lawyers, and investigators who know how to hunt in the dark. We are the ghosts that powerful men forgot to fear. I remember a woman who came to us last month. She was 80 years old, married for 60. Her husband had moved their entire savings into a crypto trust she couldn't access. She was living in her car. We found the key. We found the trail. Today, she is living in her own apartment, her dignity restored, her future secure. That is my true profit. That is my real dividend. And as for Mark, I heard he's living in a shelter now, the very one I recommended. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about that Tuesday morning. I wonder if he remembers the smell of the rosemary lamb or the sound of David's laughter. But then I realize, it doesn't matter what he remembers. What matters is what I've built. My life is no longer a reaction to his cruelty. It is a monument to my own strength. The house of glass and light I live in now is not just a residence. It is a lighthouse. It stands on the edge of the hill, overlooking the city, a reminder to everyone who looks up that silence can be transformed into a dazzling, unbreakable power. I am no longer the wife in the shadows. I am the woman who owns the light. My life is a symphony of my own making now. The notes are crisp, the rhythm is steady, and the melody is mine alone. It is a song of justice, a song of resilience, and most of all, a song of peace. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, silence is only a weakness if you let it be. If you use it to listen, to watch and to plan, it becomes your greatest strength. Stay strong, stay silent, and never, ever be underestimated. Until next time on Silent Wife's Vengeance.